the most bizarre, Last Suppers in medieval Europe, and more. Hey guys, tonight we're sitting down to dinner with some rather unfortunate dinner guests, medieval Europe's condemned prisoners, enjoying their final meals. Now, when I say enjoying, I mean that quite loosely, since most of these poor souls could barely manage a sip of ale while contemplating their upcoming appointment with the headsman's axe. We'll be exploring the oddly civilized custom of feeding people quite well, right before killing them, a practice that says more about medieval guilt than medieval mercy. So, settle in with whatever you're having for dinner tonight, and let's dig into the Last Suppers of people who definitely weren't looking forward to dessert. The origins of a grim courtesy. Let us begin with a simple question that kept medieval authorities awake at night. What do you do with a person you're about to kill? More specifically, what do you feed them? The practice of offering condemned prisoners a final meal has roots that stretch back far beyond the Middle Ages, but it was during those 1,000-odd years of European history that this custom evolved from a sporadic act of mercy into something approaching ritual. The concept itself draws from various sources, each more pragmatic than the last. There was, of course, the religious symbolism. Christ's Last Supper provided a convenient parallel for Christian authorities who needed to justify their actions. Breaking bread with someone, even someone you were about to execute, carried profound meaning in a society where sharing food was sacred. It suggested forgiveness, reconciliation, and a kind of spiritual equality that made the upcoming violence seem less personal, more administrative. But let's be honest about the practical considerations, because medieval people were nothing if not practical. A well-fed prisoner was generally a calmer prisoner, someone with a full belly and perhaps a cup or two of ale in them was less likely to cause a scene at the scaffold. They were less likely to struggle, less likely to shout accusations or curses that might turn the crowd against the authorities. A good meal served as a form of crowd control, administered one spoonful at a time. Then there was the matter of ghosts. Medieval Europeans lived in constant awareness of the supernatural, and the idea that a poorly treated prisoner might return to haunt their executioners was taken quite seriously. A condemned person who died hungry might come back hungry. A condemned person who died angry might come back angry. Better to send them off with a full stomach and, if possible, a measure of peace. The economics of execution also played a role. Public executions were expensive affairs. There was the cost of the executioner, the construction or maintenance of scaffolds, crowd control, and the lost productivity of citizens who gathered to watch. Adding the cost of a final meal was relatively minor, especially when weighed against the potential benefits of a smoother, more orderly proceeding. Food in medieval Europe was not just sustenance, it was a complex system of social signals. What you ate, when you ate it, and who you ate it with, all communicated your place in society. By offering a condemned prisoner a meal, and especially by sharing that meal with them, authorities were making a statement about justice, mercy, and the proper ordering of society. The quality and quantity of these final meals varied enormously based on region, era, and the social status of the condemned. A peasant caught stealing might receive a crust of bread and a cup of small beer. A nobleman convicted of treason might dine on roasted fowl and imported wine. These differences weren't just about kindness. They reflected the rigid hierarchies that governed medieval life, hierarchies that persisted even unto death. Regional customs developed differently across Europe, influenced by local legal traditions religious practices, and economic conditions. In some areas, the final meal became an elaborate public ceremony. In others, it remained a private act of charity, administered in the prison cell. Some regions developed specific rituals around the sharing of food between the executioner and the condemned. Others focused on the spiritual aspects, treating the meal as a form of communion. The documentation of these practices is frustratingly sparse in the early medieval period. Record-keeping was limited, and the lives of common criminals were rarely considered worth chronicling in detail. Most of what we know comes from later periods, when literacy was more widespread and bureaucratic procedures more standardized. Earlier practices must be reconstructed from scattered references in legal codes, religious texts, and the occasional chronicle that bothered to mention such mundane details. What we can say with certainty is that by the end of the medieval period, the custom of providing some form of final sustenance to condemned prisoners had become widespread across Europe, though it took different forms in different places. This wasn't the result of any grand humanitarian movement or sudden enlightenment about prisoner rights. It was the practical evolution of a system that had discovered the benefits of treating the condemned with a measure of dignity, even as it prepared to end their lives. The irony, of course, is that many prisoners couldn't eat when offered these final meals. Fear has a way of closing the throat and churning the stomach. Contemporary accounts frequently mention condemned individuals who stared at elaborate spreads without taking a bite, or who managed only a sip of wine before pushing the cup away. The meal was as much for the witnesses as for the prisoner, a demonstration that justice could be both firm and merciful. Religious foundations and early medieval practices. Having established the general framework, let us now turn to the specific religious and cultural foundations that shaped these practices in the earlier centuries of the medieval period. The early Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th through the 10th centuries, were characterized by a profound interweaving of secular and religious authority. The church didn't just influence law. In many cases, it was the law. This religious dominance shaped every aspect of how condemned prisoners were treated in their final hours. The primary concern wasn't the comfort of the body, but the salvation of the soul. Medieval Christianity taught that the moments before death were crucial for determining one's eternal fate. A person who died unrepentant faced damnation. One who died in a state of grace might hope for salvation. This belief system naturally led to practices focused on spiritual rather than physical nourishment. The Eucharist, the ritual consumption of bread and wine, representing the body and blood of Christ, became the most important meal a condemned prisoner could receive. This wasn't just symbolic. Medieval Christians believed the consecrated elements were literally transformed into divine substance. For someone facing death, this was nourishment of the highest order, far more valuable than any earthly food. The process of administering last rites was elaborate and time-consuming. A priest would hear the prisoner's confession, grant absolution for their sins, and perform the ritual of extreme unction, anointing the dying person with holy oil. Only then would the Eucharist be offered. The entire process could take hours, during which the condemned might fast completely, believing that spiritual preparation required an empty stomach. This emphasis on spiritual over physical needs created some interesting contradictions. A prisoner might be denied a hearty meal on the grounds that worldly pleasures were inappropriate for someone preparing to meet their Maker, yet be offered the most sacred food in Christendom. The logic was impeccable from a medieval perspective. Why fill the belly when you could fill the soul? The practical administration of these religious rites varied considerably across different regions and periods. In areas under direct church control, such as the Papal States, the process was highly regulated and followed established liturgical procedures. In more remote regions, or during periods of political instability, local priests might improvise, adapting the rituals to circumstances and available resources. The role of the local clergy in executions was both spiritual and administrative. Priests served as intermediaries between the condemned and the divine, but they also functioned as a kind of quality control for the execution process. A priest's presence lent legitimacy to the proceedings and provided assurance that proper procedures were being followed. This religious framework also influenced who could receive these final sacraments. Excommunicated individuals were theoretically barred from receiving the Eucharist, though exceptions were sometimes made for those facing death. Heretics might be denied religious comfort entirely, or offered a chance to recant in exchange for spiritual ministry. Jews and other non-Christians were generally excluded from Christian rites, though local customs sometimes developed alternative practices. The timing of these religious observances was carefully structured around the execution schedule. In most cases, the condemned would spend their final night in prayer and contemplation, perhaps in a chapel, or with a priest present in their cell. The morning of execution would begin with a formal service, including confession and communion. Only after these spiritual preparations were complete would the condemned be led to their death. Food played a minimal role in these early practices, but it wasn't entirely absent. Fasting was considered spiritually beneficial, but complete starvation was impractical and potentially dangerous. A prisoner who fainted from hunger might disrupt the execution proceedings or create a spectacle that reflected poorly on the authorities. Small amounts of bread and watered wine were commonly provided, enough to maintain strength without encouraging worldly indulgence. The bread served to condemned prisoners in this early period was typically coarse and dark, made from mixed grains, and often containing significant quantities of bran and other rauwveg. This wasn't necessarily a sign of cruelty. Such bread was standard fare for most of the population. White bread made from refined wheat flour was expensive and reserved for the wealthy and special religious ceremonies. Wine, when available, was often mixed with water to reduce its intoxicating effects. The goal wasn't to get the prisoner drunk, but to provide some measure of comfort and courage. The quality of wine varied enormously based on region and season. In wine-producing areas, even condemned prisoners might receive vintages of reasonable quality. In northern regions where wine was imported and expensive, the condemned might make do with local ale or mead. The preparation and serving of these simple meals were often handled by religious orders or charitable organizations. Monasteries frequently took responsibility for the spiritual and physical care of prisoners, seeing it as a work of mercy. Nuns might prepare simple broths and bread for condemned women, while monks handled the care of male prisoners. Record-keeping from this early period is fragmentary, but what evidence exists suggests that the practice of providing some form of final sustenance was already becoming established by the 8th and 9th centuries. Legal codes from the Carolingian period mention provisions for the spiritual care of condemned criminals, including references to appropriate fasting and the administration of sacraments. The question of cost was always present, but rarely documented in detail. Feeding prisoners was an expense that had to be borne by someone, usually the local authorities or religious institutions. In areas where resources were scarce, This might mean nothing more than a piece of stale bread and some water. In wealthier regions, or for more prominent prisoners, the provisions might be somewhat more generous. As we'll see, these early religious practices provided the foundation for the more elaborate customs that would develop in later centuries. The basic framework, a final meal, however simple, accompanied by spiritual ministration, became the template that different regions would adapt and modify according to their traditions and resources. England, from monastic simplicity to tavern rituals. Moving westward across the Channel, we encounter the gradual development of distinctly English customs around the feeding of condemned prisoners. Early medieval England, particularly during the Anglo-Saxon period, followed practices not dissimilar to those found elsewhere in Europe. The influence of Christianity was paramount, and most final meals were simple affairs, focused more on spiritual than physical nourishment. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought significant changes to English legal and social systems, but the evolution of last meal customs was gradual rather than revolutionary. Norman legal traditions, imported from France, emphasized the importance of proper procedure and ceremony in judicial matters. This attention to proper form would eventually extend to the treatment of condemned prisoners, though it took several centuries for distinctly English practices to emerge. During the 12th and 13th centuries, English prisons were primarily holding facilities rather than places of punishment. Most criminals were tried and either executed, mutilated, or released relatively quickly. The few prisons that existed, such as the Tower of London for political prisoners or local jails for common criminals, were generally austere places where food was a constant concern for all inmates, not just those facing execution. The diet of ordinary prisoners during this period was basic in the extreme. The standard ration consisted of bread, water, and occasionally pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever grains were available. Prisoners with means could purchase better food from their jailers, a practice that created a two-tiered system of prison nutrition. Those with money ate reasonably well. Those without subsisted on whatever charity provided. For condemned prisoners, the situation was somewhat different. The knowledge that death was imminent often prompted small acts of mercy from prison staff. A jailer might share a portion of his own meal with a prisoner facing execution the next morning, or local clergy might provide bread and ale as an act of Christian charity. These weren't systematic practices, but individual acts of compassion within a system that was otherwise quite harsh. The role of ale in English prison life cannot be overstated. Water quality in medieval England was notoriously poor, particularly in urban areas where wells might be contaminated by sewage or other pollutants. Ale, with its alcohol content and brewing process, was significantly safer to drink and was considered appropriate for consumption by people of all ages and social classes. For prisoners, access to ale was often a matter of survival rather than comfort. The brewing of ale was primarily a domestic activity carried out by women, known as alewives. The quality and strength of ale varied considerably, depending on the skill of the brewer and the ingredients available. Small ale, with low alcohol content, was the standard drink for daily consumption. Stronger ales were reserved for special occasions or for those who could afford them. Condemned prisoners might receive either type, depending on the circumstances. Small ale was practical for maintaining hydration and providing some nutrition. Stronger ale served the additional purpose of calming nerves and reducing anxiety. Contemporary accounts suggest that many prisoners welcomed the opportunity to face death with their courage, fortified by alcohol. The practice of stopping at a tavern en route to execution appears to have developed gradually over the 14th and 15th centuries. London's geography played a role in this evolution. Newgate Prison, where many condemned criminals were held, was located within the city walls. The primary execution site at Tyburn was located well outside the walls, requiring a journey of several miles through crowded streets. This journey became a public spectacle in its own right. Crowds would gather to see the condemned pass by, and the procession would often move slowly to accommodate the press of spectators. The route passed through several neighborhoods, each with its own taverns and alehouses. It was perhaps inevitable that these establishments would become involved in the proceedings. The specific tradition of stopping at St. Giles's Tavern for a final drink developed for both practical and symbolic reasons. St. Giles was the patron saint of cripples and beggars, making him an appropriate intercessor for condemned criminals. The location of the tavern, roughly halfway between Newgate and Tyburn, provided a convenient stopping point for the procession. The great bowl of ale offered at St. Giles's became famous throughout London and beyond. This wasn't a small cup or tankard, but a substantial vessel that could hold a pint or more of ale. The condemned was expected to drink deeply, both as a final earthly pleasure and as preparation for what was to come. The crowd would often cheer or jeer, depending on how the prisoner handled this final drink. The ceremony at St. Giles's also served practical purposes for the authorities. It provided an opportunity to gauge the mood of the crowd and the condition of the prisoner. A prisoner who couldn't hold their ale might be too weak or sick to proceed with the execution, potentially creating problems at the scaffold. A crowd that seemed particularly hostile or sympathetic to the condemned might require additional crowd control measures. The financial arrangements for these drinks were handled in various ways. Sometimes the prisoner or their family would pay for the ale. In other cases, local authorities would cover the cost as part of the execution expenses. Occasionally, sympathetic members of the crowd would pay for the condemned's drink as an act of charity. The quality of ale offered at St. Giles's became a matter of some importance. Tavern keepers competed for the honor of serving condemned prisoners, seeing it as a form of advertising. A condemned criminal who praised the quality of their final ale might generate business for the establishment. Conversely, one who complained about poor beer might damage a tavern's reputation. The social dynamics of these tavern stops were complex. The condemned might find themselves drinking alongside the very officials who had prosecuted them, as well as the executioner who would shortly end their life. This forced intimacy created opportunities for final reconciliations, last-minute confessions, or dramatic confrontations. Contemporary accounts describe prisoners who used these moments to declare their innocence, make final pleas for mercy, or simply express their appreciation for one last taste of good English ale. The tradition also reflected broader English attitudes toward crime and punishment. The notion that even a condemned criminal deserved basic human dignity was deeply embedded in English legal culture. The offering of a final drink wasn't just an act of mercy, it was a demonstration that English justice was civilized and proportionate. Weather played a significant role in these proceedings. A journey from Newgate to Tyburn in winter cold or summer heat could be an ordeal in itself. The stop at St. Giles's provided relief from the elements and an opportunity for both prisoner and escort to recover their strength. On particularly harsh days, the ale might be heated with spices, creating a warming drink that helped combat the cold. The types of crime that led to execution at Tyburn varied considerably over the centuries. Highway robbery, murder, treason, and theft of goods worth more than a shilling all carried the death penalty. The nature of the crime sometimes influenced how the condemned was treated during their final journey. Those guilty of particularly heinous offenses might find the crowd less sympathetic and the tavern stop less comfortable. As English legal procedures became more formalized during the Tudor period, the customs around final meals and drinks began to stabilize into recognizable traditions. What had once been informal acts of charity became expected procedures that authorities felt obligated to provide. This evolution would continue into the early modern period, when the English approach to condemned prisoners' final meals became famous throughout Europe for its combination of ceremony and compassion. France, the sovereignty of the soul. Crossing the Channel to examine French practices, we encounter a markedly different approach to the final hours of condemned prisoners. While England developed increasingly elaborate rituals around the provision of food and drink, France maintained a more austere tradition that prioritized spiritual preparation over physical comfort. This difference reflected deeper cultural distinctions between the two kingdoms, as well as the particular influence of French religious institutions on judicial procedures. The French approach to criminal justice during the medieval period was heavily influenced by Roman law traditions, as filtered through church doctrine and royal prerogative. The concept of justice was intimately connected to the idea of divine order, and punishment was seen as a necessary restoration of cosmic balance rather than simply a deterrent to future crime. This philosophical framework naturally led to practices that emphasized the condemned's relationship with God rather than their immediate physical needs. French prisons during the medieval period varied considerably in their conditions and management. The royal prisons, such as the Châtelet in Paris, or the various fortress dungeons scattered throughout the kingdom, were generally better maintained and supplied than local jails. However, even in the best circumstances, prison food was basic and often inadequate. The standard diet consisted of bread, water, and occasional supplements of cheese, vegetables, or thin soup. The quality of bread available to prisoners reflected the rigid social hierarchies of medieval France. White bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour was reserved for the nobility and wealthy merchants. Brown bread, made from less refined flour, was the standard fare for artisans and middling social classes. The coarsest bread, made from mixed grains and often containing significant quantities of bran and other additives, was typically provided to prisoners and the poorest members of society. Water quality in French prisons was a constant concern. Many facilities drew their water from wells that might be contaminated by sewage or other pollutants. Wine, when available, was often preferred for its safety, as much as its psychological effects. However, wine was expensive and not always accessible to prison authorities. In many cases, prisoners had to make do with water that had been boiled or treated with herbs in an attempt to make it safer for consumption. The role of religious orders in French prison administration was particularly significant. Monasteries and convents often took responsibility for the spiritual welfare of prisoners, including the provision of basic necessities. The Brothers of Charity, for example, made regular visits to Parisian prisons to provide food, medical care, and religious instruction to inmates. These religious volunteers were often the source of whatever additional nourishment condemned prisoners received in their final days. The actual practice of providing final meals to condemned prisoners in medieval France was irregular and dependent on local customs and available resources. Unlike the increasingly standardized procedures developing in England, French practices varied significantly from region to region and even from case to case. A prisoner in Paris might receive very different treatment from one in Lyon or Toulouse, depending on local traditions and the resources available to prison authorities. For ordinary criminals facing execution, the provision of food was often minimal. A condemned thief or murderer might receive nothing more than the standard prison ration of bread and water on their final day. Any additional food would come from the charity of religious organizations or the personal kindness of prison staff. The focus was firmly on preparing the soul for eternity, rather than comforting the body in its final hours. The preparation of condemned prisoners for execution was primarily a religious function carried out by clergy. The process typically began several days before the scheduled execution, with daily visits from priests who would hear confession, provide spiritual instruction, and administer the sacraments as appropriate. This extended preparation period was seen as crucial for ensuring that the condemned died in a state of grace. The question of who could receive the final sacraments was complex and sometimes controversial. Excommunicated individuals were theoretically barred from communion, though exceptions might be made for those who demonstrated genuine repentance. Heretics faced a more difficult situation. They might be offered the sacraments only if they publicly recanted their beliefs and submitted to church authority. The case of Joan of Arc illustrates these complexities perfectly. Joan's situation was particularly delicate because she had been excommunicated for heresy and refusing to submit to church authority. Under normal circumstances, this would have barred her from receiving the Eucharist. However, her captors recognized that denying her the final sacraments might create a martyr and potentially destabilize their political position. The decision to allow her communion was thus as much political as spiritual. The bread and wine provided to Joan represented the most basic form of final meal in the French tradition. Unlike the elaborate feasts that were developing in Germanic regions, or the convivial ale-drinking customs of England, French practice focused on the essential elements of Christian nourishment. The communion host was often the only food a condemned heretic would receive on their final day. For condemned members of the nobility, the situation was somewhat different. Social rank continued to matter, even in the shadow of death, and aristocratic prisoners often received better treatment throughout their imprisonment. This might include access to better food, the ability to have meals sent in from outside the prison, and greater freedom to arrange their final affairs. However, even noble prisoners were expected to observe proper spiritual preparation in their final days. The economics of providing food to condemned prisoners was always a consideration for French authorities. Prisons were expensive to maintain, and every additional cost had to be justified to royal or municipal treasuries. The provision of elaborate final meals was seen as an unnecessary expense that might set precedents for future cases. It was more cost-effective to rely on religious charity and the basic prison rations than to establish formal procedures for special final meals. Regional variations in French practice were significant. Northern France, with its closer ties to Flemish and English customs, occasionally adopted more elaborate final meal traditions. Southern France, with its strong Roman law traditions and different religious customs, maintained more austere practices. The wine-producing regions naturally had better access to quality alcoholic beverages, which might be provided to condemned prisoners as a form of spiritual and physical comfort. The influence of the University of Paris and other centers of learning on French judicial practices was considerable. Legal scholars debated the appropriate treatment of condemned prisoners including questions about final meals and spiritual preparation. These academic discussions helped shape the theoretical framework within which French practices developed, though the implementation was often quite different from the scholarly ideals. The practical administration of executions in France was carefully regulated by royal ordinances and local customs. The timing of executions, the methods used, and the procedures for handling condemned prisoners were all subject to detailed rules. However, these regulations typically said little about final meals, leaving such matters to local discretion and available resources. The types of crime that carried the death penalty in medieval France were numerous and varied by social class. Nobles might be executed for treason or rebellion against royal authority. Commoners could face death for murder, theft, heresy, or various forms of assault. The nature of the crime sometimes influenced how the condemned was treated in their final hours, though this was more a matter of custom than formal law. The seasonal availability of food also affected what might be provided to condemned prisoners. Winter executions might feature warming broths or heated wine, while summer executions might include fresh bread and cool water. The harvest cycle determined what foods were available and affordable at different times of year, creating natural variations in prison diets and final meal options. French execution methods during the medieval period included hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, and various forms of breaking or dismemberment. The chosen method sometimes influenced the final meal provided. Prisoners facing burning might be given additional food and drink to help them endure the ordeal, while those facing beheading might be encouraged to fast or eat lightly to avoid vomiting on the scaffold. The public nature of most French executions meant that the treatment of condemned prisoners was subject to popular scrutiny. A crowd that perceived the authorities as treating a prisoner with excessive cruelty or kindness might react accordingly. This public pressure sometimes influenced decisions about final meals and other comforts provided to the condemned. As French legal and administrative systems became more sophisticated during the later medieval period, the customs around final meals began to stabilize into more predictable patterns. However, the French approach remained more restrained and spiritually focused than the elaborate traditions developing in other parts of Europe. This difference would persist into the early modern period and beyond, reflecting fundamental cultural attitudes about crime, punishment, and the proper relationship between body and soul in the face of death. Germanic lands, the theater of reconciliation. As we venture eastward into the complex patchwork of territories that comprise the Holy Roman Empire, we encounter perhaps the most elaborate and systematized approach to final meals in medieval Europe. The Germanic lands, with their distinctive legal traditions, strong urban cultures, and complex social hierarchies, developed final meal customs that were both more generous and more ritualized than those found elsewhere in Europe. The foundation of Germanic final meal traditions lay in ancient concepts of honor, reconciliation, and community responsibility that predated Christianity. Germanic legal culture placed enormous emphasis on the restoration of social harmony after crimes had been committed. This wasn't simply a matter of punishing wrongdoers. It was about healing the wounds that crime had inflicted on the community fabric. The elaborate final meals that developed in German cities were, in many ways, the culmination of this reconciliation process. The urban centers of the Holy Roman Empire were particularly important in developing these traditions. Cities like Nuremberg, Frankfurt, Augsburg, and Cologne had sophisticated legal systems relatively prosperous economies, and strong traditions of civic governance. These conditions created an environment where elaborate final meal customs could develop and be sustained over time. The cost of providing substantial meals to condemned prisoners was manageable for wealthy urban governments, and the civic benefits of appearing both just and merciful were considerable. Nuremberg, as one of the empire's most important trading centers, provides an excellent example of how these customs developed. The city's extensive archives contain detailed records of prison expenses, including specific itemizations of food provided to condemned prisoners. These records reveal a systematic approach to final meals that went far beyond simple charity or religious obligation. The Nuremberg system typically provided enhanced rations to condemned prisoners for the 3 days preceding their execution. This wasn't a single elaborate meal, but a sustained period of better nutrition designed to prepare the prisoner physically and psychologically for their fate. The improvement in diet was dramatic compared to standard prison fare. Instead of bread, water, and thin gruel, condemned prisoners might receive meat, cheese, vegetables, decent bread, and substantial quantities of beer or wine. The specific menu items provided to condemned prisoners in Nuremberg were carefully documented and appear to have followed established patterns. A typical 3-day final meal period might include eggs prepared in various ways, multiple types of meat, chicken, veal, pork, or beef, depending on availability and season, bread rolls rather than coarse prison bread, and generous portions of local beer or imported wine. The quantities provided were substantial, often more food than a working-class family might consume in several days. The preparation of these final meals was handled by professional cooks employed by the city, not by prison staff or volunteers. This ensured consistent quality and allowed for more elaborate preparation methods. Meat might be roasted rather than simply boiled. Bread would be fresh rather than stale, and beverages would be of good quality. The goal was to provide food that would be recognized as genuinely superior to normal prison fare. The setting for these final meals was also carefully considered. Many German prisons had special rooms designated for condemned prisoners during their final days. These spaces were typically better lit, better ventilated, and more comfortable than standard prison cells. The famous Hangman's Room in Nuremberg's dungeon, with its table, chair, and window, providing natural light, exemplifies this approach. The condemned would dine in surroundings that were almost pleasant, a stark contrast to the harsh conditions they had previously endured. The role of the executioner in these final meal rituals was uniquely Germanic. In other parts of Europe, executioners were generally figures of fear and revulsion, avoided by respectable society, and forced to live apart from normal communities. In the German lands, executioners occupied a different social position. While still somewhat marginalized, they were often respected craftsmen with hereditary positions and recognized expertise in their profession. The tradition of the executioner sharing a drink with the condemned, the famous St. John's blessing, was central to Germanic final meal customs. This ritual typically took place after the condemned had finished eating, often on the final evening before execution. The executioner would visit the prisoner's cell, often dressed in his finest clothes, and would formally request the prisoner's forgiveness for what he was about to do. The shared drink that followed this request was usually strong alcohol, schnapps, brandy, or fortified wine. The choice of St. John the Baptist as the patron of this ritual was theologically significant. John was himself executed by beheading on the orders of a ruler who had initially been reluctant to kill him, making him an appropriate intercessor for both executioners and condemned prisoners. The ritual drinking was seen as invoking St. John's blessing on both participants. The psychological purposes of this shared drink were multiple. For the condemned, it provided liquid courage for the ordeal ahead and a final moment of human connection before death. For the executioner, it offered a way to personalize what was otherwise an impersonal professional duty. By asking forgiveness and sharing a drink, the executioner transformed himself from an agent of vengeance into a fellow human being, carrying out a necessary but regrettable task. The practical benefits of these elaborate final meal customs were considerable. Well-fed prisoners were generally more cooperative and less likely to cause disruptions during their execution. The 3-day feeding period allowed prison authorities to monitor the condemned's physical and mental condition and to make adjustments if necessary. A prisoner who became ill or showed signs of complete mental breakdown might have their execution postponed or their treatment modified. The public relations value of these customs was also important. Germanic cities competed with each other for trade, prestige, and political influence. A reputation for conducting executions in a civilized and humane manner enhanced a city's standing and demonstrated its commitment to proper governance. Foreign merchants and diplomats who witnessed or heard about these customs would carry news of German justice and mercy to other parts of Europe. The seasonal variations in Germanic final meals reflected both agricultural cycles and cultural preferences. Winter executions might feature hearty stews, roasted meats, and warming spiced wine. Summer executions could include fresh vegetables, lighter meats, and cooler beverages. The availability of different foods throughout the year created natural variations in final meal menus, though the basic principle of providing superior nutrition remained constant. The question of cost was always present, but appears to have been readily accepted by German civic authorities. The expense of providing elaborate final meals was substantial, sometimes equivalent to several days' wages for a skilled craftsman. However, these costs were seen as necessary expenses of proper governance, similar to the costs of maintaining courts, jails, and execution facilities. The social dynamics of Germanic final meals were complex and carefully managed. The presence of city officials, clergy, and sometimes even family members created opportunities for final reconciliations and last-minute interventions. These meals weren't simply feeding rituals, they were social events that allowed the condemned to make peace with their fate and their community. The documentation of specific cases, such as that of Susanna Margaretha Brandt in Frankfurt, reveals both the elaborateness of these customs and their occasional failures. Brandt's final feast, attended by the officials who had condemned her, represented the pinnacle of Germanic final meal traditions. The enormous quantities of food provided, enough to feed a large family for several days, demonstrated the city's commitment to treating condemned prisoners with dignity and respect. The fact that Brandt could barely eat despite this lavish provision illustrates the psychological challenges that no amount of good food could overcome. Fear, despair, and anticipation of death frequently overwhelmed condemned prisoners' ability to appreciate even the finest meals. The food was as much for the witnesses as for the condemned, a demonstration that Germanic justice was both firm and humane. The methods of execution commonly used in Germanic lands influenced these final meal customs. Beheading by sword, considered an honorable death, was often preceded by the most elaborate meals. Hanging, seen as less honorable but still acceptable for common criminals, might involve somewhat simpler final provisions. More extreme punishments, such as breaking on the wheel or burning at the stake, created different challenges for final meal planning. The guild system that dominated Germanic urban life extended to the provision of final meals. Bakers, brewers, butchers, and other food craftsmen took pride in their contributions to these final feasts. The quality of their products would be judged not only by the condemned, but by the officials and witnesses present. This created incentives for providing the best possible food and drink. Religious considerations remained important in Germanic final meal customs, though they were integrated into, rather than opposed to, the elaborate feeding rituals. Clergy would be present to provide spiritual counsel and to ensure that the condemned's final preparations included proper attention to their souls as well as their bodies. The combination of spiritual and physical nourishment was seen as providing the best possible preparation for death. The evolution of Germanic final meal customs continued throughout the late medieval and early modern periods, reaching their most elaborate forms in the 16th and 17th centuries. By that time, what had begun as simple acts of mercy had developed into complex ceremonial procedures that could last for days and involve dozens of participants. These customs would eventually influence practices in other parts of Europe and provide models for final meal traditions that would persist into the modern era. Italian states, piety and restraint. Moving southwards to the Italian peninsula, we encounter a markedly different approach to the final hours of condemned prisoners. The Italian states, despite their political fragmentation, shared certain cultural and religious characteristics that shaped their treatment of those facing execution. The overwhelming influence of the Catholic Church, the legacy of Roman legal traditions, and the particular Italian understanding of honor and dignity combined to create final meal customs that were more restrained than those developing in Germanic lands, but more spiritually focused than English practices. The Italian approach to condemned prisoners was fundamentally shaped by the concept of bella mort, the beautiful death. This wasn't merely about dying bravely or stoically. It encompassed a complex set of behaviors and preparations that demonstrated the condemned's readiness to meet their maker. A beautiful death required proper spiritual preparation, acceptance of one's fate, and a demonstration of continued faith, despite the circumstances. These requirements naturally prioritized spiritual over physical nourishment. The political fragmentation of medieval Italy created enormous variations in local customs and legal procedures. The northern city-states, like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, developed sophisticated legal systems influenced by Roman law and commercial necessity. The papal states in central Italy operated under canon law and ecclesiastical authority. The southern kingdoms of Naples and Sicily combined Norman, Germanic, and Islamic legal traditions. Despite these differences, certain common patterns emerged in the treatment of condemned prisoners. Prison conditions throughout medieval Italy were generally harsh, reflecting both limited resources and contemporary attitudes toward criminal punishment. The majority of prisoners were held in underground dungeons or fortress cells that were dark, damp, and poorly ventilated. Food was typically minimal and of poor quality, consisting mainly of bread, water, and occasional supplements of cheese or vegetables. The contrast with Germanic prisons, where condemned prisoners might enjoy substantial final meals, was striking. The role of religious orders in Italian prison administration was particularly significant. Monasteries and convents often provided whatever charitable support was available to prisoners, including food, medical care, and spiritual guidance. The Brothers of Mercy, active in many Italian cities, made regular visits to prisons, specifically to comfort condemned prisoners and help them prepare for death. These religious volunteers were frequently the only source of additional food or drink that condemned prisoners received. The emphasis on spiritual preparation in Italian practice often extended to the final day or days before execution. Condemned prisoners were typically moved to a chapel or a cell with access to religious services where they would spend their time in prayer, confession, and contemplation. The physical environment of these final preparations was deliberately austere, reflecting the belief that worldly comforts were inappropriate for someone preparing to face divine judgment. The provision of food during this final spiritual preparation period was carefully regulated to support rather than distract from religious observance. Fasting was often encouraged or required, based on the belief that an empty stomach aided spiritual concentration and demonstrated proper penitence. When food was provided, it was typically simple and symbolic: bread and water, perhaps with a small amount of wine for communion purposes. The quality of bread available to condemned prisoners reflected both economic constraints and religious symbolism. The bread provided was usually coarse and dark, similar to what was eaten by the poor and by religious communities practicing voluntary poverty. White bread, made from refined flour, was expensive and considered inappropriate for penitential purposes. The bread, served to condemned prisoners, was often blessed by clergy and carried symbolic weight as well as nutritional value. Wine played a complex role in Italian final meal customs. On one hand, it was recognized as having medicinal and calming properties that could help condemned prisoners face their ordeal with greater courage. On the other hand, excessive consumption of alcohol was seen as incompatible with proper spiritual preparation. The solution was typically to provide small amounts of wine, often mixed with water, that would provide comfort without causing intoxication. The timing of food provision was carefully coordinated with religious observances. The condemned might fast completely on their final day until after receiving communion, at which point they would be offered simple food to maintain their strength for the execution. This pattern reflected the belief that the Eucharist was the most important final meal any Christian could receive, making earthly food secondary in importance. Regional variations within Italy were significant, reflecting different political systems, economic conditions, and local traditions. Venice, with its sophisticated commercial economy and republican government, developed more systematic approaches to prisoner care than did smaller city-states with limited resources. The Papal States, under direct ecclesiastical authority, emphasized religious preparation almost exclusively. The southern kingdoms, with their feudal structures and limited urban development, often relied on local customs that varied from place to place. The influence of canon law on Italian execution practices was considerable. Church doctrine provided detailed guidance on the spiritual preparation of condemned prisoners, including recommendations for confession, absolution, and final communion. These religious requirements took precedence over any considerations of physical comfort, and local secular authorities generally deferred to ecclesiastical expertise in such matters. The role of confraternities, lay religious organizations, in providing comfort to condemned prisoners was uniquely Italian. These groups, which existed in most major Italian cities, made it their mission to accompany condemned prisoners through their final hours and to ensure they received proper spiritual and physical care. Members of these confraternities would visit prisons, provide simple food and drink, and offer prayers and companionship to those facing execution. The types of crimes that carried the death penalty in medieval Italian states were numerous and varied by jurisdiction. Political crimes, especially treason against ruling authorities, were commonly punished by death. Religious crimes, including heresy and blasphemy, carried severe penalties under church law. Common criminal offenses such as murder, robbery, and rape also frequently resulted in execution. The nature of the crime sometimes influenced how the condemned was treated in their final hours. The social status of condemned prisoners continued to matter even in the face of death. Noble prisoners often received better treatment throughout their imprisonment and might be allowed special privileges in their final days, including access to better food and the ability to receive visitors. Common criminals typically received only the basic care provided by religious charity. This social stratification reflected the hierarchical nature of medieval Italian society. The methods of execution commonly used in Italian states influenced final meal customs. Beheading, considered an honorable death appropriate for nobles, was often preceded by more elaborate final meals and ceremonies. Hanging, used for common criminals, typically involved simpler final provisions. Burning at the stake, reserved for heretics and other serious religious offenders, was often preceded by intensive spiritual preparation that included fasting rather than feasting. The influence of Renaissance humanism on Italian execution practices became apparent in the later medieval period. The growing emphasis on human dignity and individual worth began to affect how condemned prisoners were treated, though these changes developed slowly and unevenly across different regions. The concept of providing comfort to condemned prisoners became more accepted, though it remained subordinate to spiritual concerns. The practical administration of executions in Italian states was heavily influenced by public sentiment and political considerations. Popular prisoners might receive better treatment in their final hours, while those who had committed particularly heinous crimes or who were politically unpopular might find less sympathy from authorities and the public. These factors could significantly affect what food and comfort were provided to condemned prisoners. The documentation of specific final meal practices in medieval Italian states is often fragmentary, reflecting both the limited record-keeping of the period and the tendency to focus on spiritual rather than physical aspects of execution preparation. What records do exist suggest that Italian practices were generally more austere than those developing in other parts of Europe, though they were also more consistent in their emphasis on human dignity and proper spiritual preparation. The economic considerations involved in providing final meals to condemned prisoners were always present, but were often overshadowed by religious and political factors. The cost of providing simple food and drink to condemned prisoners was relatively minor compared to other execution expenses, and these costs were often covered by religious organizations or private charity rather than public funds. The seasonal availability of food affected what could be provided to condemned prisoners, though the emphasis on simple, symbolic foods meant that seasonal variations were less important than in regions where elaborate final meals were customary. Bread and wine, the staples of Italian final meals, were available year-round, though their quality and cost might vary with the seasons. The public nature of most Italian executions meant that the treatment of condemned prisoners was subject to popular scrutiny and comment. Crowds gathered to witness executions often had strong opinions about whether prisoners were being treated appropriately, and these opinions could influence both immediate decisions and future practices. As Italian legal and administrative systems evolved during the later medieval period, final meal customs began to stabilize into more predictable patterns. However, the fundamental Italian emphasis on spiritual preparation over physical comfort remained constant, creating a distinctive approach that differed significantly from the more elaborate traditions developing elsewhere in Europe. Social hierarchies and the economics of final meals. Having surveyed the regional variations in final meal customs across medieval Europe, we must now examine how these practices reflected and reinforced the complex social hierarchies that dominated medieval life. The question of what a condemned prisoner ate in their final hours was never simply about nutrition or mercy. It was a reflection of their place in society, the nature of their crime, and the economic realities of medieval prison administration. The medieval social order was rigidly stratified, with clearly defined roles and expectations for different classes of people. These distinctions did not disappear at the prison gate or the scaffold. If anything, they became more pronounced in the heightened atmosphere surrounding executions. A condemned nobleman could expect treatment vastly different from that accorded to a peasant thief, and these differences extended to every aspect of their final meal experience. Nobility facing execution often retained many of their privileges even in their final hours. Aristocratic prisoners might be confined in relative comfort, with access to their own servants, private quarters, and the ability to have meals prepared according to their preferences. When the Duke of Buckingham was executed for treason in 1521, he spent his final night dining on courses of his own choosing, served on silver plate in his Tower of London apartments. The food itself, roasted fowl, fine wine, white bread, imported delicacies, was far superior to anything available to common prisoners. The ability to pay for better treatment was crucial in determining the quality of final meals. Medieval prisons operated on what we might recognize today as a fee-for-service basis. Prisoners with means could purchase better food, more comfortable accommodations, and additional privileges. Those without money had to rely on whatever basic provisions the prison provided, or whatever charity they could obtain from religious organizations or sympathetic individuals. The cost of providing elaborate final meals was substantial in medieval economic terms. A single condemned nobleman's final feast might cost more than a peasant family's food budget for an entire year. The 3-day feeding regimen provided to condemned prisoners in Nuremberg represented a significant municipal expense that had to be budgeted and justified to city councils. These costs were accepted because they served important political and social functions, but they were always carefully monitored. The sources of funding for final meals varied considerably across different regions and jurisdictions. In some cases, municipal authorities included prison expenses in their regular budgets, viewing the provision of final meals as a necessary cost of administering justice. Religious organizations often contributed food and labor through charitable programs designed to comfort the condemned. Private individuals sometimes paid for final meals as acts of mercy or to fulfill religious obligations. The preparation of final meals required significant labor and expertise, particularly for elaborate feasts provided to high-status prisoners. Professional cooks, servers, and other staff had to be employed or contracted for these occasions. The logistics of obtaining quality ingredients, preparing complex dishes, and serving them in prison environments presented considerable challenges that added to the overall cost. The quality of ingredients available for final meals reflected both economic constraints and seasonal availability. Meat was expensive and often reserved for special occasions or wealthy individuals. Fresh vegetables were available only seasonally and were frequently too costly for routine prison use. Bread quality varied enormously based on the type of grain used and the degree of processing, with white bread being significantly more expensive than dark, coarse varieties. Wine and beer were important components of many final meals, but their availability and quality depended on local production and trade connections. Wine-producing regions could provide condemned prisoners with local vintages of reasonable quality at relatively modest cost. Areas without local wine production had to rely on expensive imported varieties or substitute local beer and ale. The seasonal timing of executions affected both the cost and availability of final meal components. Winter executions might require preserved or imported foods, increasing expenses considerably. Summer executions could take advantage of fresh local produce, but might face challenges in food preservation without refrigeration. These seasonal variations created natural fluctuations in final meal quality and cost. The preparation methods available for final meals were limited by the technology and facilities of medieval kitchens. Most food was prepared by boiling, roasting over open fires, or baking in simple ovens. Elaborate sauces, complex seasonings, and sophisticated preparation techniques were available only to wealthy households with skilled cooks and proper equipment. Prison kitchens were typically basic facilities designed for preparing simple, nutritious meals in large quantities. The serving of final meals required appropriate dishes, utensils, and table settings. Wealthy prisoners might have access to their own silver or pewter plates, fine glassware, and proper linens. Common prisoners typically ate from wooden bowls or simple pottery, using basic utensils or their hands. These differences in presentation reinforced social distinctions even in the condemned's final hours. The social rituals surrounding final meals varied according to the prisoner's status and the local customs. Elaborate final banquets for noble prisoners might include multiple courses, formal service, and the presence of distinguished guests. Simple final meals for common criminals might be eaten alone or in the company of religious counselors. These variations reflected different expectations about how people of different social ranks should be treated. The psychological effects of social distinctions in final meal provision were significant for both condemned prisoners and observers. Noble prisoners who received elaborate final meals might feel their dignity was being maintained, even in their final hours. Common prisoners who received only basic provisions might feel abandoned or forgotten by society. These perceptions could affect how condemned individuals faced their deaths and how observers judged the justice system. The gender of condemned prisoners also influenced final meal arrangements. Women facing execution were often treated differently from men, reflecting medieval attitudes about female fragility and moral capacity. Female prisoners might receive more attention from religious orders, different types of food considered appropriate for women, and modified social arrangements around their final meals. The age of condemned prisoners was another factor affecting final meal provision. Young prisoners might receive special consideration based on beliefs about their moral development and capacity for redemption. Elderly prisoners might require modified diets based on their physical condition and ability to digest different foods. Children facing execution, though rare, presented particular challenges for authorities trying to balance justice with mercy. The nature of the crime committed also influenced final meal arrangements. Prisoners convicted of particularly heinous offenses might find public sympathy limited and their final meal provisions correspondingly reduced. Those convicted of crimes that generated public support or sympathy might receive better treatment. Political prisoners often received special consideration based on their status and the political implications of their cases. The efficiency of medieval administrative systems affected the consistency and quality of final meal provision. Well-organized jurisdictions with adequate resources could provide relatively standardized final meals to condemned prisoners. Less efficient systems might provide inconsistent treatment based on the personal preferences of individual officials or the availability of resources at the time of execution. The training and supervision of prison staff influenced how final meal customs were actually implemented. Guards and administrators, who understood the importance of these rituals, were more likely to carry them out properly. Those who saw final meals as unnecessary expenses or administrative burdens might provide minimal compliance with formal requirements while undermining the spirit of the customs. The documentation and record-keeping practices of different jurisdictions affected our modern understanding of final meal customs. Some authorities kept detailed records of prison expenses, including specific information about final meals provided to condemned prisoners. Others maintained only minimal records or focused on different aspects of execution procedures. These variations in documentation create uneven historical knowledge about actual practices. The evolution of final meal customs over time reflected changing social attitudes, economic conditions, and administrative capabilities. Early medieval practices were generally simple and informal. Later, medieval customs became more elaborate and systematized. The transition between these periods involved gradual changes in expectations, resources, and procedures that varied considerably across different regions and jurisdictions. The comparison between final meal customs and other aspects of medieval hospitality reveals important cultural values and social expectations. The obligation to feed guests, even unwelcome ones, was deeply embedded in medieval culture. The extension of hospitality to condemned prisoners represented an extreme application of these values, demonstrating the strength of cultural norms about proper treatment of others. The relationship between final meal customs and broader criminal justice reforms shows how these practices evolved as part of larger changes in legal and social systems. Improvements in final meal provision often accompanied other reforms designed to make executions more humane and orderly. These changes reflected growing concerns about the proper limits of government power and the rights of individuals facing punishment. Methods of execution and their influence on final meals. The relationship between execution methods and final meal customs in medieval Europe reveals much about contemporary attitudes toward both punishment and mercy. Different methods of execution created different practical and psychological challenges that influenced what food and drink were provided to condemned prisoners. Understanding these connections helps illuminate the complex calculus of compassion and efficiency that governed medieval execution practices. Beheading, whether by sword or axe, was generally considered the most honorable form of execution and was typically reserved for nobility or those convicted of political crimes. The speed and relative cleanliness of a well-executed beheading made it the preferred method for high-status prisoners. and this preference extended to the final meal arrangements that preceded such executions. Prisoners facing beheading were often provided with the most elaborate final meals, partly because their social status warranted such treatment, and partly because the quick nature of their execution made dietary concerns less problematic. A condemned nobleman might enjoy multiple courses, fine wine, and sophisticated preparations, without worrying about digestive complications during the execution. The certainty of quick death made it possible to indulge in rich foods that might be uncomfortable if the execution were prolonged. The technical requirements of successful beheading also influence final meal planning. Executioners preferred prisoners who were calm and cooperative, as any movement or resistance could result in a botched execution that would reflect poorly on their professional competence. A well-fed prisoner, fortified with good wine, was more likely to approach the block with the necessary composure, making the executioner's job easier and the spectacle more dignified. The symbolic aspects of beheading as an execution method also supported more elaborate final meal customs. Since beheading was associated with honor and noble birth, the entire execution process was designed to maintain the dignity of both the condemned and the justice system. Providing a final feast demonstrated that even in death, the prisoner's social status was recognized and respected. Hanging was far more common than beheading and presented different challenges for final meal planning. The process of hanging could be unpredictable, sometimes resulting in a quick death, but often involving prolonged strangulation that might last several minutes. This uncertainty created practical problems for determining appropriate final meal provisions. Prisoners facing hanging were generally advised to eat lightly on their final day, as a full stomach could cause vomiting during the strangulation process, creating an undignified spectacle that officials preferred to avoid. The common practice of providing ale or wine to condemned prisoners before hanging served multiple purposes. It provided courage, helped ensure cooperation, and might hasten unconsciousness during the strangulation process. The social status of most hanging victims, typically common criminals rather than nobility, also influenced their final meal arrangements. These prisoners usually received simpler provisions than those facing beheading, reflecting both their lower social rank and the more practical concerns associated with their execution method. A mug of ale and a piece of bread were often considered adequate final provisions for a common thief or murderer. The public nature of most hangings created additional considerations for final meal planning. Large crowds often gathered to witness hangings, and their reactions could influence the success or failure of the execution from a political perspective. A prisoner who vomited or lost control of bodily functions due to overeating could generate sympathy or disgust that might complicate future executions or undermine public support for the justice system. Burning at the stake, typically reserved for heretics, witches, and other religious offenders, presented unique challenges for final meal planning. The prolonged and extremely painful nature of death by burning made normal dietary considerations almost irrelevant, as no amount of food or drink could meaningfully prepare someone for such an ordeal. Prisoners facing burning were often encouraged to fast rather than feast in their final hours, reflecting the belief that spiritual preparation was more important than physical comfort when facing such a horrific death. The emphasis on confession, repentance, and prayer in the hours before burning naturally led to practices that prioritized spiritual over physical nourishment. When food was provided to prisoners facing burning, It was typically simple and symbolic: bread and water, perhaps with a small amount of wine for courage. The goal was to maintain sufficient strength for the final journey to the stake, while avoiding any appearance of indulgence that might suggest the prisoner was not taking their spiritual preparation seriously. The public nature of burnings and their religious significance also influenced final meal customs. These executions were often highly charged political and religious events that attracted large crowds and significant attention from authorities. The treatment of condemned prisoners in their final hours was scrutinized for its theological and political implications, making elaborate final meals inappropriate or even counterproductive. Breaking on the wheel, used for particularly serious crimes, involved a prolonged and extremely painful execution process that could last for hours. This method presented perhaps the greatest challenges for final meal planning, as prisoners had to be prepared for an ordeal that was both lengthy and extraordinarily painful. Prisoners facing breaking on the wheel were sometimes provided with substantial amounts of alcohol or other substances intended to dull their senses and reduce their suffering. The goal was not pleasure but mercy, attempting to minimize the condemned's awareness of their prolonged torture. This represented a different approach to final provision than the dignified feasts provided to those facing quicker deaths. The practical challenges of breaking on the wheel also influenced final meal timing. Since the execution could last for many hours, prisoners needed sufficient strength to survive the initial stages of the process. This sometimes led to providing food and drink at intervals during the execution itself, rather than only in the hours beforehand. Drawing and quartering, reserved for the most serious political crimes, involved disembowelment and dismemberment while the prisoner was still alive. This method was designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible, and final meal customs were minimal or non-existent for prisoners facing such a fate. The extreme nature of drawing and quartering made normal considerations of mercy or dignity largely irrelevant. Prisoners facing this fate were typically viewed as having committed crimes so serious that they forfeited any claim to compassionate treatment. Final provisions, if any, were limited to basic necessities needed to maintain consciousness through the execution process. Drowning, sometimes used for specific crimes or in certain jurisdictions, presented different practical challenges. The process was usually relatively quick, but the fear and panic associated with drowning made dietary preparation less important than psychological preparation. Final provisions for prisoners facing drowning were typically minimal and focused on providing courage rather than comfort. The seasonal and weather considerations associated with different execution methods also influenced final meal planning. Outdoor executions during winter required different preparations than summer executions, and the choice of execution method sometimes depended on weather conditions. These factors created additional variables in determining appropriate final meal provisions. The availability of skilled executioners also influenced both execution methods and final meal customs. A jurisdiction with a competent headsman might prefer beheading and provide elaborate final meals accordingly. Areas without skilled executioners might rely on hanging or other methods that required different final meal arrangements. The political and social messages conveyed by different execution methods were reinforced by associated final meal customs. Elaborate beheading ceremonies with sumptuous final feasts demonstrated the power and mercy of ruling authorities. Simple hangings with minimal final provisions sent different messages about the consequences of crime and the limits of official compassion. The cost considerations associated with different execution methods extended to final meal planning. Elaborate executions required more resources overall, making expensive final meals a relatively small additional cost. Simple executions operated under tighter budget constraints that naturally limited final meal options. The training and expertise required for different execution methods also affected final meal planning. Executioners who understood the technical requirements of their chosen method could provide better guidance about appropriate final meal arrangements. Less skilled executioners might provide inadequate advice that could complicate the execution process. The religious and cultural significance of different execution methods influence final meal customs through their association with different theological and moral frameworks. Methods associated with honor and dignity naturally supported more elaborate final meal customs, while methods associated with shame and punishment led to more austere practices. The evolution of execution methods over time was accompanied by corresponding changes in final meal customs. As certain methods became more or less common, the associated final meal practices evolved accordingly. This evolution reflected changing attitudes toward punishment, mercy, and the proper limits of government power. The regional variations in preferred execution methods created corresponding variations in final meal customs. Areas that favored beheading developed more elaborate final meal traditions, while regions that relied primarily on hanging maintained simpler practices. These regional differences reflected local legal traditions, available resources, and cultural preferences. The relationship between execution methods and final meal customs illustrates the complex, practical, and symbolic considerations that govern medieval criminal justice. Every aspect of the execution process, from the condemned's final meal to the method of death itself, carried multiple layers of meaning that reflected contemporary values about justice, mercy, social hierarchy, and the proper ordering of society. Seasonal rhythms and agricultural constraints. The provision of final meals to condemned prisoners in medieval Europe was profoundly shaped by the agricultural rhythms that governed food production and availability throughout the year. Understanding these seasonal constraints helps illuminate both the practical challenges faced by prison administrators and the symbolic significance attached to different types of food at different times of year. The medieval agricultural calendar created dramatic variations in food availability that affected every aspect of society, including the treatment of condemned prisoners. The abundance of late summer and early autumn harvests contrasted sharply with the scarcity of late winter and early spring, when stored food supplies dwindled and fresh produce was unavailable. These seasonal fluctuations influenced both the quantity and quality of food that could be provided to prisoners facing execution. Spring executions, occurring after the long deprivations of winter, often featured the simplest final meals. Stored grains might be running low, preserved meats nearly exhausted, and fresh vegetables not yet available from gardens. The food provided to condemned prisoners during these months typically consisted of whatever basic provisions remained in prison stores: coarse bread made from mixed grains, thin ale or watered wine, and perhaps small amounts of preserved cheese or dried fish. The scarcity of spring also created opportunities for acts of particular mercy or cruelty. A condemned prisoner who received fresh bread or a bit of meat during the hungry months might feel especially grateful for such kindness. Conversely, Authorities who provided only the most minimal provisions during spring might be seen as merely reflecting the general scarcity, rather than showing deliberate harshness. The quality of bread available during spring months was often poor, as the best grains had been consumed earlier in the year, and remaining stores might be mixed with inferior grains, peas, or other fillers. The bread provided to condemned prisoners during these months would have been coarse, dark, and often difficult to digest. However, even poor bread was preferable to no bread at all, and prisoners might express genuine gratitude for such basic sustenance. Water quality also varied seasonally, with spring often providing the cleanest and most abundant supplies, as winter ice melted and refilled wells and cisterns. This seasonal improvement in water availability might be one of the few advantages of spring executions, though the benefit was often offset by the general scarcity of other foods. Summer executions presented different challenges and opportunities. The growing season provided fresh vegetables and herbs that could improve prison diets, though these improvements were often modest. Gardens might provide onions, cabbage, turnips, and other hardy vegetables that could supplement the basic bread and porridge that formed the foundation of prison nutrition. The heat of summer created preservation challenges that affected final meal planning. Meat spoiled quickly in warm weather, making it expensive and potentially dangerous to provide to prisoners. Fresh dairy products were also problematic during hot weather, limiting the options available for final meal preparation. These constraints often led to summer final meals that emphasized preserved foods, fresh vegetables, and cooling drinks. The availability of fresh ale during summer months was generally good, as the brewing season was active and supplies were relatively fresh. However, the quality of ale could deteriorate quickly in hot weather, requiring careful attention to storage and timing. Condemned prisoners might receive ale that was fresher and of better quality during summer months, though the risk of spoilage was always present. The longer daylight hours of summer also affected execution schedules and final meal timing. Executions typically occurred during daylight hours for practical and symbolic reasons, and the extended summer days provided more flexibility in scheduling both final meals and execution proceedings. This additional time might allow for more elaborate final meal preparations or extended spiritual counseling. Autumn executions occurred during the season of greatest food abundance, when harvest festivals celebrated the year's agricultural success. This timing often allowed for the most generous final meals, as fresh grains, fruits, vegetables, and newly slaughtered animals provided a wide range of options for prison administrators seeking to provide substantial final meals to condemned prisoners. The harvest season also brought new beer and wine, as fresh grains and grapes were processed into alcoholic beverages. Condemned prisoners executed during autumn months might receive better quality drink than those executed at other times of year, reflecting both the availability of fresh supplies and the general spirit of abundance associated with harvest time. The symbolic significance of autumn executions was complex, as the season associated with gathering and preservation might seem inappropriate for ending lives. However, the practical advantages of food abundance often outweighed symbolic considerations, and many jurisdictions preferred to schedule executions during months when providing adequate final meals was less expensive and challenging. The preservation activities of autumn also influenced final meal planning, as communities prepared for winter by smoking meats, pickling vegetables, and brewing large quantities of ale and wine. Prison administrators might take advantage of these activities to improve their stores of preserved foods that would be available for winter executions. Winter executions presented the greatest challenges for final meal provision. The cold weather made heating and food preparation more difficult and expensive, while the general scarcity of fresh foods limited available options. Final meals during winter months typically consisted of preserved foods, stored grains, and whatever heating drinks could be prepared to provide warmth and comfort to condemned prisoners. The heating of food and drink became particularly important during winter executions. Warm ale, mulled wine, or heated broths provided both physical comfort and psychological reassurance to prisoners facing death in cold weather. The extra fuel required for heating represented an additional expense that had to be balanced against the benefits of providing warm final meals. The psychological effects of winter weather on condemned prisoners also influence final meal planning. The cold, darkness, and general harshness of winter months might deepen the despair of prisoners facing execution, making whatever comfort could be provided through final meals especially valuable. A warm meal and heated drink might provide meaningful solace to someone spending their final hours in a cold, damp prison cell. The preservation methods available during winter also affected final meal quality. Smoked meats, pickled vegetables, and aged cheeses provided variety and nutrition that might not be available from fresh sources. However, these preserved foods were often heavily salted or otherwise treated in ways that might make them less palatable or appropriate for final meals. The festival calendar overlaid on agricultural seasons created additional considerations for final meal timing and content. Executions scheduled during major religious festivals like Christmas, Easter, or Pentecost might receive special attention in terms of final meal provision, reflecting both the spiritual significance of these occasions and the generally improved food availability associated with festival celebrations. Lenten restrictions during the pre-Easter period created particular challenges for final meal planning. The Church's prohibition on meat consumption during Lent might be waived for condemned prisoners on grounds of mercy, or it might be strictly enforced as part of their spiritual preparation for death. These religious dietary restrictions could significantly limit final meal options during certain times of year. The timing of local saints' days and regional festivals also influenced final meal customs. A prisoner executed during a local harvest festival might receive a final meal that reflected the community's celebration, while one executed during a time of great celebration, a period of religious observance, might receive more austere provisions appropriate to the spiritual season. Market schedules and trading patterns created additional seasonal variations in food availability. Cities that depended on imported foods might have better supplies during certain seasons when trade routes were active and weather conditions favorable for transportation. Rural areas with limited access to markets might show greater seasonal variations in food quality and availability. The labor demands of agricultural seasons also affected prison administration and final meal preparation. During busy periods like planting or harvest, fewer people might be available for prison duties, potentially reducing the quality or quantity of final meals provided to condemned prisoners. Conversely, during slack agricultural periods, more attention might be paid to such details. The economic cycles associated with agricultural seasons influence the resources available for final meal provision. Autumn, with its harvest profits and general prosperity, might see more generous final meal allowances. Spring, with depleted stores and limited cash flow, might force more stringent economies in prison food provision. The health impacts of seasonal nutrition patterns also affected condemned prisoners and their final meal experiences. Prisoners who had endured months of winter scarcity might be weakened and less able to appreciate or digest elaborate final meals. Those who had benefited from summer and autumn abundance might be in better condition to enjoy whatever final provisions were offered. The relationship between seasonal food availability and final meal customs illustrates the complex interplay between practical constraints and symbolic intentions that characterize medieval criminal justice. Authorities seeking to provide merciful treatment to condemned prisoners had to work within the limits imposed by agricultural cycles and seasonal variations, creating final meal traditions that reflected both human compassion and natural necessity. The economics of medieval prison administration. The provision of final meals to condemned prisoners must be understood within the broader economic context of medieval prison administration. Operating prisons was expensive and often unprofitable, requiring careful attention to costs and revenues that inevitably influenced how condemned prisoners were treated in their final hours. The economic realities of prison management shaped final meal customs in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Medieval prisons served multiple functions beyond simply housing criminals awaiting trial or execution. They were also used to confine debtors, political prisoners, and individuals awaiting ransom payments. This diverse population created complex administrative challenges and varied revenue streams that influenced overall prison operations, including food provision for all categories of prisoners. The fee-for-service model that characterized medieval prison administration meant that prisoners who could pay received better treatment than those who could not. This system extended to final meal provision, creating a two-tiered structure where wealthy condemned prisoners might enjoy elaborate final feasts, while poor prisoners received only basic sustenance. The economic incentives of this system encouraged prison administrators to provide whatever level of service they could afford. Prison fees typically covered accommodation, food, and basic services, though the quality of each varied enormously based on payment levels. Wealthy prisoners might pay for private cells, regular meals prepared by external cooks, and various privileges that made imprisonment more bearable. Poor prisoners relied on whatever basic provisions the prison could afford to provide from its operating budget or from charitable sources. The accounting records that survive from medieval prisons reveal the detailed attention paid to food costs and provision. Prison administrators tracked expenses for bread, ale, meat, vegetables, and other supplies with the same care they devoted to other operational costs. These records show that food represented a significant portion of total prison operating expenses, making efficiency and cost control essential concerns. The procurement of food for prisons required established relationships with local suppliers and careful attention to seasonal price variations. Prison administrators typically contracted with bakers, brewers, butchers, and other food providers for regular supplies at agreed-upon prices. These contracts often included provisions for emergency supplies and special occasions, such as final meals for condemned prisoners. The economics of bread production were particularly important for prison administration, as bread typically formed the foundation of prison diets. The cost of grain, the availability of milling services, and the skill of contracted bakers all influenced both the cost and quality of bread provided to prisoners. Final meals for condemned prisoners might feature better quality bread than was normally provided, representing a small but meaningful additional expense. Brewing and ale provision presented complex economic challenges for prison administrators. The cost of grains for brewing, the labor required for the brewing process, and the equipment needed for production all had to be factored into prison operating budgets. Some prisons operated their own breweries to reduce costs and ensure adequate supplies, while others relied on external suppliers. The quality control of ale and other alcoholic beverages was important, both for prisoner health and for maintaining good relationships with suppliers. Spoiled or contaminated ale could sicken prisoners and create additional medical expenses, while consistently poor quality beverages might damage relationships with suppliers or reduce prisoner cooperation. Final meals for condemned prisoners often featured better quality ale than normal prison provisions. Meat provision was among the most expensive components of prison food budgets. The cost of purchasing animals, the expense of slaughter and processing, and the challenges of preservation made meat a luxury item in prison diets. Condemned prisoners might receive meat as part of their final meals, when others received only bread and vegetables, representing a significant additional expense that had to be justified to oversight authorities. The seasonal variations in food costs created budgeting challenges for prison administrators. Spring scarcity drove up prices for stored foods, while autumn abundance might provide opportunities for bulk purchases at favorable prices. Administrators had to balance current expenses against future needs, while maintaining adequate provisions for all categories of prisoners, including those facing execution. The labor costs associated with food preparation and service represented another significant expense category. Prisons needed cooks, servers, and food handlers to maintain their operations, and these positions required wages that had to be included in overall operating budgets. Special final meals for condemned prisoners often required additional labor that increased costs beyond normal food expenses. The equipment and facilities needed for food preparation represented capital investments that influenced long-term prison operating costs. Kitchens, storage areas, brewing equipment, and serving facilities all required initial investments and ongoing maintenance that affected the economic viability of prison operations. Better equipped prisons could provide higher quality final meals, but at greater overall cost. The waste management associated with food service created additional expenses that prison administrators had to consider. Spoiled food, kitchen scraps, and food packaging materials all required disposal that might involve labor costs or payments to waste removal services. These seemingly minor expenses could accumulate to significant amounts over time. The security considerations associated with food service also influenced costs. Knives, cooking implements, and serving utensils could potentially be used as weapons by prisoners, requiring careful control and monitoring that increased labor costs. The provision of special final meals to condemned prisoners required particular attention to security, as these prisoners might be especially motivated to attempt escape or violence. The charitable contributions that supplemented prison food budgets created both opportunities and administrative challenges. Religious organizations, wealthy individuals, and community groups often provided food or money for prison operations, particularly for condemned prisoners. Managing these charitable relationships required administrative time and effort that represented an indirect cost to prison operations. The corruption and inefficiency that plagued medieval administrative systems also affected prison food provision. Administrators might divert food supplies for personal use, Suppliers might deliver inferior goods while charging for premium products, and staff might steal food intended for prisoners. These problems increased costs and reduced the quality of services provided to all prisoners, including condemned individuals awaiting execution. The political considerations that influence prison administration often overrode purely economic calculations. High-profile prisoners might receive expensive final meals regardless of cost, while politically unpopular prisoners might receive minimal provisions despite available resources. These political factors created unpredictable variations in expenses that complicated budget planning and resource allocation. The legal requirements that governed prison operations created mandatory expenses that administrators could not avoid. Requirements to provide adequate food, access to religious services, and humane treatment all carried costs that had to be included in prison budgets. Final meal provisions for condemned prisoners often fell into this category of mandatory expenses, though the specific requirements varied by jurisdiction. The insurance and risk management considerations associated with prison operations influenced food provision policies. Administrators who failed to provide adequate nutrition might face prisoner unrest, increased sickness, or higher mortality rates that could create legal or political problems. The cost of preventing these problems through better food provision was often less than the cost of dealing with their consequences. The comparison between prison operating costs and other government expenses reveals the relative priority given to prisoner welfare in medieval budgets. Final meal provisions for condemned prisoners represented a small fraction of total execution costs, which themselves were minor compared to other judicial and administrative expenses. This context helps explain why such provisions were generally accepted as reasonable expenses. The evolution of prison economics over time reflected changing attitudes toward prisoner welfare and criminal justice. Early medieval prisons operated with minimal budgets and provided only the most basic services. Later, medieval facilities often had more substantial budgets that allowed for better food provision, including more generous final meals for condemned prisoners. The regional variations in prison economics created corresponding differences in final meal customs. Wealthy jurisdictions could afford more elaborate final meal provisions, while poor areas provided only basic sustenance. These economic constraints often had more influence on final meal quality than did cultural or religious factors. The legacy of medieval prison economics continued to influence criminal justice systems well beyond the medieval period. The principle that prisoners deserved basic humane treatment, including adequate food, became established during the medieval period and provided the foundation for later reforms in prison administration and prisoner welfare. The tradition of providing final meals to condemned prisoners, established during the medieval period primarily for economic and practical reasons, persisted as a symbol of the humanity that could exist even within systems of punishment and death. Conclusion: the last morsel of mercy. As we reach the end of our long journey through the darker corridors of medieval Europe, we find ourselves contemplating a rather sobering truth. The final meal tradition was never really about the food. Like so many human customs that persist across centuries, it served multiple masters: spiritual, political, economic, and deeply personal. The condemned prisoner raising a tankard of ale at St. Giles's Tavern, the German nobleman sharing strong wine with his executioner, the Italian heretic receiving only bread and water. Each participated in a ritual that said more about the living than the dying. The evolution of these customs across medieval Europe reveals the peculiar genius of human adaptability. Faced with the necessity of ending lives for the sake of justice, societies developed elaborate mechanisms to preserve their own sense of humanity. The final meal became a kind of moral pressure valve, allowing authorities to demonstrate mercy, even while administering ultimate punishment. It transformed executioners from agents of vengeance into reluctant servants of necessity. It gave condemned prisoners a final taste of the world they were leaving behind. Yet we must not romanticize these practices. The same societies that carefully prepared final feasts for condemned prisoners also employed execution methods of extraordinary cruelty. The same legal systems that provided bread and wine to the condemned also prescribed death for crimes as minor as theft. The mercy evident in final meal customs coexisted with a broader justice system that was often harsh, arbitrary, and profoundly unequal. The regional variations we have examined reflect broader cultural differences that shaped medieval European civilization. The English emphasis on convivial drinking and communal reconciliation mirrors the pragmatic approach to governance that characterized Anglo-Saxon and later Norman legal traditions. The French focus on spiritual preparation over physical comfort reflects the deep integration of religious and secular authority that marked Capetian monarchy. The elaborate German traditions of reconciliation and ceremonial forgiveness echo the complex honor cultures that governed Holy Roman Empire politics. The Italian emphasis on dignified restraint demonstrates the influence of both classical Roman traditions and medieval Catholic doctrine. These differences remind us that medieval Europe was not a monolithic civilization, but a complex mosaic of local customs, regional traditions, and evolving practices. The condemned prisoner's final meal served as a kind of cultural fingerprint, revealing the values and priorities of the society that provided it. A feast or a fast, ale or wine, solitude or company, each choice reflected deeper assumptions about justice, mercy, social hierarchy, and human dignity. The economic realities that shaped final meal customs illustrate the practical constraints within which medieval ideals had to operate. The most elaborate expressions of mercy toward condemned prisoners occurred in the wealthiest cities and kingdoms, while poorer jurisdictions could afford only minimal provisions. This pattern reflects a harsh truth about human compassion. It is often easier to extend mercy when the cost is manageable than when resources are scarce. The seasonal rhythms that influenced final meal availability remind us how closely medieval life was tied to agricultural cycles and natural constraints. A condemned prisoner's final meal might be elaborate or austere, based simply on when their execution was scheduled, relative to harvest seasons and food preservation capabilities. This dependence on natural cycles created variations in mercy that had nothing to do with the condemned's crimes or character. The social hierarchies that determined final meal quality reveal the persistence of class distinctions even at the moment of death. A nobleman might dine sumptuously in his final hours, while a peasant thief received only bread and water, not because their crimes were different in moral weight, but because their social positions demanded different treatment. These distinctions remind us that medieval justice, however elaborate its ceremonies of mercy, remained fundamentally unequal. The spiritual dimensions of final meal customs reflect the profound influence of Christianity on medieval legal and social systems. Whether through elaborate communion rituals, simple bread and wine offerings, or periods of fasting and prayer, the condemned spiritual preparation took precedence over physical comfort in most medieval jurisdictions. This emphasis on the soul's welfare over the body's needs reflected theological priorities that shaped every aspect of medieval life. The practical considerations that influenced final meal customs, from execution methods to crowd control to administrative convenience, remind us that even the most idealistic human institutions must function within the constraints of physical reality. The mercy shown to condemned prisoners had to be balanced against concerns about cost, security, public order, and operational efficiency. Perhaps most importantly, the final meal tradition reveals something fundamental about human nature itself. Even societies capable of extraordinary violence retained the impulse to extend small kindnesses to those they were about to kill. Even condemned criminals facing certain death could find meaning in a cup of wine, a piece of bread, a moment of human connection. Even executioners performing the ultimate violation of human life sought forgiveness and reconciliation with their victims. The persistence of final meal traditions across different regions, time periods, and legal systems suggests that they fulfilled deep human needs that transcended specific cultural contexts. They provided a way for societies to maintain their sense of civilization while engaging in legally sanctioned killing. They offered condemned prisoners a final opportunity to experience human dignity and compassion. They created space for reconciliation, forgiveness, and acceptance within systems designed to deliver retribution. As we consider these medieval practices from our modern perspective, we might reflect on how little has changed in the fundamental human dynamics surrounding punishment and mercy. Contemporary debates about capital punishment still grapple with questions of justice, deterrence, human dignity, and the proper limits of state power that troubled medieval authorities. Modern final meal traditions in jurisdictions that still practice capital punishment echo many of the same themes and serve many of the same functions as their medieval predecessors. The condemned prisoner's final meal thus serves as more than a historical curiosity. It provides a window into human nature itself, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion, our need for ritual and meaning in the face of mortality, our persistent search for dignity and humanity even in the darkest circumstances. In the end, these medieval customs remind us that even at the scaffold's shadow, human beings remain stubbornly, persistently, inexorably human. The bread shared, the wine poured, the final toast raised. These simple acts carried the weight of centuries of human struggle to reconcile justice with mercy, punishment with compassion, necessity with humanity. They represent perhaps the last best expression of the medieval belief that even those who had forfeited their right to life retained their essential human dignity. In a world often marked by casual cruelty and institutionalized violence, the final meal stood as a small but significant assertion of human worth. And so, as the candle burns low and the shadows lengthen, we leave these medieval halls of justice with their strange mixture of savagery and mercy, their elaborate rituals of reconciliation and retribution. The condemned have long since departed, their final meals concluded, their accounts settled. What remains is the record of humanity's endless struggle to preserve its soul while doing what it believes necessary for survival. In the sharing of bread and wine with those about to die, medieval Europe found a way to kill without entirely losing its capacity for kindness. Perhaps that is mercy enough. The last drops of wine have been drunk, the final crumbs swept away. The feast is ended, the reckoning complete. In the growing darkness, we can only hope that when our own final moment comes, we too might find such small mercies waiting, such human kindness in the face of final judgment. For in the end, we are all condemned prisoners awaiting sentence, hoping against hope for a cup of wine, a piece of bread, a moment of forgiveness before we face whatever darkness awaits beyond the scaffold's edge. May we all receive such mercy when our time comes to leave this table where we have supped so long together, and may we extend such kindness to others who, like us, await their final meal in the shadow of eternity's gallows.